Chapter 1296 Fireball. Luo Song charged at Salanji, his body burning in midair like a huge fireball. And as he charged, the flames grew fiercer and fiercer. Gradually, this ball of fire had turned into a huge fireball with a diameter of 4 or 5 meters. Salanji, facing this attack, did not take it easily, but cautiously chose to dodge and avoid it. On the contrary, after that fireball made a dash, it quickly rushed towards Salanji again. The speed, surprisingly, was getting faster and faster. Rolling friction was just small, not much could be done about it. Snort dash ... Above the battlefield, white mist soon filled the air. Gawain tempered the ice and snow, then vaporized it. The battlefield was filled with white vapor. For a time, it was difficult to see where people were with a blank field of vision. And since the entire battlefield had been covered with flames by Luo Song in advance, there was no way to turn on the infrared viewing mode. As a result, the scene in the battlefield was also confusing to the people outside. Zhang Yi could not help but slowly nod his head and marveled, "That's really smart." Leang Yu, as an expert in the field of combat, also saw the brilliance of this trick. He knows that this battle is not the final battle. Even after winning this round, one must still face the next enemy. Therefore, there was no chance given to others to observe his fighting style. Even Zhang Yi was helpless in the face of this situation. The way humans observed external objects was nothing more than the 5 senses of the body. And among them, what the eyes see is the main way of observing external objects. When one cannot see, one's judgment of a thing is greatly diminished. He couldn't see it, and neither could anyone else, so now the crowd could only wait for the outcome of the battle inside. Salanji was in the middle of the white mist, and there was a rumbling in his ears. That was the great commotion of the flaming chariot that Luo Song had transformed into, charging towards him. He couldn't really see, but his ears were still good. The only flaw was that the surrounding area had been sprinkled with a large amount of grease by Luo Song, burning up in flames. This greatly affected Salanji's judgment, making his eyes almost useless. There was another point that lay beneath the feet. Under the influence of the Gawain, the ice field under his feet was also rapidly melting. A huge depression soon formed. No lake was formed as all the water was rapidly vaporizing. Rumble! The flame chariot once again came from the midst of the mist, and as he approached, the dazzling golden flames were still so obvious. Salanji's eyes solidified violently. He decided to touch Luo Song head-on and try the other party's bottom line. As a reinforced mutant, he did not fear a head-on collision. With the Vajra rod gripped tightly in his hand, facing the crushing giant fireball, Salanji roared and swept his stick horizontally. Only in this way could one maximally be avoided unloading the force. Boom! The full force of the Vajra rod's strike fiercely blasted onto Luo Song's body. Golden flames spilled out in all directions like meteors, passing through the battlefield plain and crashing everywhere. A sound like thunder could be heard from several kilometers away. But as the stick went down, there was no imagined image of stopping the opponent. The spherical rolling Luo Song was still able to dislodge most of Salanji's power. Salanji's pupil shrunk violently, turning back to see Luo Song flying in midair, covered in grease and burning with golden flames. The corners of Luo Song's mouth, with a Maitreya Buddha-like smile, had a mocking meaning in it. He was covered in thick fat, plus a large amount of ghee had been temporarily poured over him, which was both good fuel and could be secreted from amongst his skin. This created a natural protective layer. It was an excellent defense against a reinforced mutant like Salanji. Phew! Luo Song stopped rolling after he landed on the ground, and his limbs landed on the ground, violently spraying a golden blaze at Luo Song. This fiery flame was long and thin, exiting like a silk thread, then slowly thickening, shooting out hundreds of meters in one breath. The Gawain flames were aimed at Salanji. Salanji, who had just used his old moves, was caught off guard and was only able to use his arms to block it, while quickly dodging. However, wherever he dodged, Luo Song's flames followed him like a shadow. Soon, both of his arms became scorched black. Salangi clenched his teeth as he felt intense pain. Even a 1,000-hammered body couldn't block this super Gaowen flame jet. Luosang was smug in his heart. The flames I spray out can reach 5,000 degrees Celsius, even the strongest materials can be melted. Salangi had to retreat backward in a sorry state and rolled to dodge. Raising his eyes again, his flesh and blood had been scorched black. If he hadn't counteracted the heat of the flames with his supernatural abilities, at this point, he was afraid that his entire body would have been burnt to a crisp. Salangi's face was incomparably calm. As an ascetic, he had once prostrated on the mountain path of the Great Snow Mountain on a bitterly cold winter's day, wearing a single garment and knocking his long head. His body was tattered and bloodied from stone pricks, and he hadn't even frowned. This injury, he could endure. But at this time, the injuries left behind by Gelier's dying blow were a little too much to suppress. Gelier was also a reinforced mutant, and knew very well where the weaknesses of the reinforced line were. Even if one could build the skin and bones and muscles flawlessly, the organs were still fragile in order to maintain physiological functions. What that blow had caused Salangi was an internal injury. At first, he was able to forcefully suppress it, but once he started fighting at full strength, his internal organs would be in vague pain. This was undoubtedly fatal in the middle of a duel between experts. Salangi grimaced as the muscles on his arms bulged. The life force and regenerative ability of the reinforced mutants were terrifying. The injuries caused by the cauterization wouldn't bleed and wouldn't affect his fighting strength. Luosang was staring at Salangi dead-on, but still had a Mithraea-like smile on his face, which added to the feeling of terror. Flames are his main means of attack. Also, looking at his torso, he also possesses great strength and defense in melee combat. But at the level of pure strength and speed, I have an absolute advantage. Then it's better to avoid the shortcomings by building on the strengths. Salangi quickly formulated a tactic in his mind after he was injured. Luosang's body had coiled into a huge ball of meat, golden flames blazing as it began to roll once again. However, at this very moment, Salangi let out a roar from his mouth, and with one foot, he crushed the earth under his feet and came straight at Luosang. Rushing to Luosang's heels at breakneck speed before he could even roll up. In the beginning, you were using the advantage of distance to roll up and increase your speed. But with such an obese body, it's a struggle to start, isn't it? If I don't let you roll, I'll see what you can use to rush me. Chapter 1297 Spirit of the Weapon. Salangi discovered the characteristics of Luosang's means of attack. Luosang's impact power came from the power after accelerating, but his own power was definitely not stronger than Salangi's. Therefore, it was just a matter of interrupting the spellcasting. Salangi rushed to Luosang. At this moment, Luosang was coiled into a ball and could not dodge Luosang's speed at all. The Vajra rod thundered in the clear sky, waving a terrifying residual shadow in the air, bursting like thunder, and heavily smashing into Luosang's obese body. Pfft! The Vajra rod sunk deep into the flesh. The layers of superficial fat and grease were whipped, rippling up a layer of meat waves. The terrifying force was removed quite a bit, but it still jerked Luosang directly away, like a kicked leather ball. Boom! The huge ball of meat landed on the ground, violently bouncing on the ground a dozen times before stopping. Luosang had a surge of chi and blood, but after that layer of natural defense unloaded its force, it kept him from being smashed into mud. However, his body was still left with a horrible bruise, and soon the wound left by that Vajra rod turned a dark purple color. It's effective, again. Salangi took advantage of the situation, and like the wind and lightning, wrapped in a thunderous momentum leapt to mid-air, and struck down hard with a stick aimed at Luosang's head. Extreme power is such a horror, able to restrain all the fancy. Luosang's face changed, his fat body narrowly rolled away. Boom! The earth shattered in response, and a large amount of ice and snow was shattered and streaked out. As this battle went on, this snow plain had been sunk by more than 10 meters, and white steam filled the surroundings, so no one could see clearly what was happening inside. Zhang Yi was calm, but he said to Leang Yu to himself, "Get ready to make your debut." It's almost your turn. Leang Yu said, you think Salanji can't win? Zhang Yi said indifferently, the probability is that he will lose. It was not because Zhang Yi looked down on Salanji's strength. Rather, it was the injuries on Salanji's body. Injuries to the internal organs. For a mutant who attacked from a distance, they could still be forcibly suppressed through medication and willpower. But for the close combat reinforcement mutants, the injuries would worsen every time he exercised vigorously. Perhaps it could be suppressed in the beginning, but when the fight got to the back, he could not help himself. Phew! A blazing amazing wave shot up from the white misty battlefield plain, surprisingly dispersing a large portion of the mist. It also allowed one to temporarily see the scene inside clearly. Salanji was holding a Vajra rod, his magnificent body was like a black iron tower, his feet stepping on the earth as if he was a Vajra that would not fall. Luo Song, on the other hand, appeared in the distance in some distress, panting heavily. There were 3 ebony-purple stick marks on his fat body, looking hideous and terrifying. That part of the flesh and blood had been completely necrotic. If he didn't have a lot of fat on his body, if these attacks landed on his body, he was afraid that all his organs would be broken. This was also the reason why most of the ancient military generals had big bellies and did not care about being all muscular. A body shape that was truly conducive to fighting must need to have fat as a cushion. Looking at the status quo, it was clear that Salanji had the upper hand. The eyes of the Paji family's private soldiers were bright, as if they saw the hope of victory. Worthy of being Lord Salanji, just awesome. This is the #1 warrior of our Paji family. Who can defeat him? Maybe Lord Salanji will be able to accomplish 1 through 3 and defeat the 3 of their mutants. It'll be exciting then. The private soldiers of the Paji family had already begun to imagine beautifully. Zhang Yi and Leang Yu looked at Salanji on the field, but they did not think that the situation was very optimistic. Salanji, who did not seem to have any problems, subconsciously appeared to have a small movement of his abdomen shrinking inward as he moved around. This could not be hidden from Zhang Yi's duo. Salanji's internal injuries were becoming more and more severe and had to be contained by force to allow him to maintain his fight on the field. Unless he was able to quickly take down the Luosang in front of him, otherwise, the longer the battle dragged on, the more unfavorable it would be for him. However, how was he going to take down this fatty who was covered in grease and had hundreds of pounds of fat? Salanji's eyebrows went up, and at this moment, he also knew that the injuries on his body were flaring up. It had to be a quick battle. Looking at Luosang in front of him, his hand slowly twisted the Vajra rod. The next moment his feet violently stomped on the ground, and like a cannonball he charged towards Luosang. This time, the Vajra rod in his hand transformed into a lance and began to use the spikes on the other end to launch an attack on Luosang. Luosang similarly sensed Salanji's intention to play with his life, still full of smiles. His arms were interlaced, and even more terrifying flames surged out from his body, as one flame after another coiled like long snakes, tearing towards Salanji. The blazing flames burned out Salanji's hair, turning him into a big, dark bald head. But he didn't have the slightest fear, and against the blazing Gaowen, he used the Vajra rod in his hand to dispel a flame, and then went running towards Luosang with unabated momentum. But just at this time, that meatball-like big fatty didn't choose to fight Salanji hard. Instead, like a leather ball, he bounced and dodged backwards. Ha, the injuries on your body are flaring up, aren't they? Keep dragging it on and soon you'll be vomiting blood yourself. Who's playing with your life? Luosang had already seen what was wrong with Salanji. Luosang was well aware of Gelier's strength, and with the dying blow that he had given up his life, even an expert like Salanji would definitely be heavily injured. Then, it would be good to delay it slowly. Luosang began to pull away, launching long-range attacks on Salanji with Gaowen flames. Zhang Yi noticed that the man's figure seemed to have shrunk a bit as he slowly fought on. Starting to get a little thin? In other words, he's storing grease in his body and treating himself as an oil can. Zhang Yi stroked his chin, kind of interesting. But soon, he said to Leang Yu next to him, "Get ready, it's your turn to go on soon." Leang Yu nodded, In her hand she held a long sword. In order to hide her identity, it was naturally not Dragon's Roar, but another Edelman metal weapon. "Right, don't forget to bring this with you," Zhang Yi said, reaching out and lifting Flower from his shoulder and placing her in Liang Yu's arms. Liang Yu was dumbfounded as she looked at Flower dumbfounded. "What are you doing?" Zhang Yi said with an expression of taking things for granted. "As a mutant who is able to control beasts, it's reasonable for you to bring a war beast with you when you go into battle, isn't it?" Until this time, Liang Yu finally realized why Zhang Yi was so confident that he would be able to win this duel. Because according to the level of strength, Flower, who had already opened her genetic lock, was even more powerful than Liang Yu. If such a combination appeared, it would be a complete BUG-level existence. Liang Yu froze for half a day and finally held back a sentence. "I thought that you thought I was that 1 in a million genius." Zhang Yi pointed at Flower with a smirk. "Even if you are a genius, it's safer to add an artifact spirit to you, isn't it?" Chapter 1298 A Smart Man. Above the battlefield, the battle between Salanji and Luosang was still raging. Salanji was like a hunter and killed, chasing Luosang with his Vajra rod in hand. Luosang knew that it wasn't conducive to his abilities if he fought in close combat, so he kept on wandering and stalking, and kept on utilizing Gaowen flames to attack Salanji. The strengths of the two were already relatively close, yet the injuries on Salanji's body were like a time bomb that didn't know when it would explode. So in this way, Salanji had to suppress his injuries while fretting inside to end the fight. His speed and strength were both stronger than Luosang, so he quickly caught up with Luosang and viciously raised the Vajra rod in his hand and smashed it against Luosang's body. Luosang had no choice but to turn around, choosing to take Salanji's attack with his back. Bang! A dull thud rang out on the flat ground like a muffled thunderbolt had been released. The fat flesh on Luosang's back cascaded like waves, but he still couldn't completely dislodge Salanji's force. The Vajra rod was so fast that it tore through Luosang's back like a sharp blade. Blood soared, Luosang's mouth let out a muffled grunt, and then with the help of this force, he violently leapt forward. Salanji had already killed his eyes, following closely over, slashing down with stick after stick. Against the blazing flames around Luosang's body, his Vajra rod mercilessly landed on Luosang's back. Ah! As the stick landed, another skin and flesh split open. Even a big fatty like Luosang who was full of fat couldn't help but wail. He topped off his several hundred pounds of body, but he actually scattered and ran faster. Luosang also knew that the Salanji at the moment was using a desperate fight, but he didn't want to end up with Salanji, so he could only choose to run away and delay time. Thus on the battlefield, a very comical scene appeared. The two first-class mutants of the Snowy Region Plateau turned out to be like punks, one desperately fleeing in the front, and the other pounding away with a Vajra rod in the back. Well, this is probably the so-called return to basics. Everyone looked at this scene, although they felt a little funny inside, no one really laughed out. Every single person stared at them dead-on, wanting to see who could last until the end. Finally, after 10 minutes of AO fighting, Salanji's injuries finally caused a wisp of incoherence to appear in his movements. And this incoherence was reflected in the slowing down of his speed in chasing Luosang. Luosang's back had been beaten to a pulp, but it wasn't just blood that flowed out, more surprisingly, it was white fat with yellow grease. He looked badly injured, but he was still running fast, screaming in agony as he ran. On the contrary, it was Salanji who slowly moved a bit heavy. The movements of the two, the general public couldn't see clearly at all, and they didn't know how the battle was going, they only knew that Salanji had been pressing Luosang to fight, while Luosang only had the chance to run away. But Zhang Yi and Liang Yu saw clearly where Salanji's problem was. Luosang felt the harshness of the stick wind behind him, and his long-suppressed anger finally burned. But instead of rushing, he continued to flee forward. He was only suffering from some superficial wounds now, which were painful but not fatal, allowing him to still be able to keep up a decent fight. Waiting a little longer, until the injuries to Salanji's internal organs had completely disintegrated, he would turn back and burn him into a fragrant roasted whole lamb. Luo Song's mind was making perfect plans. Suddenly, Salanji, who had been desperately chasing him, stopped moving. He slowly slowed down and stood on the snowy plain. Luo Song also stopped at a distance, staring at Salanji with a puzzled and cautious expression. Why does he suddenly look so calm? Could it be that some stance is about to be used? Luo Song realized that something was wrong. It was because Salanji's expression was too calm like he was already indifferent to what he was doing. It was like it was about to give up his life. Luo Song was like an enemy. He sank down, his thick limbs supporting the ground like pillars. After taking a deep breath, his body puffed up like a balloon, and his already obese body had hardened and doubled in size. This was his defensive stance. No matter what kind of attack he faced, he could use this body of grease to make a purely natural defense. Right at this time, Salanji opened his mouth and said in a voice that wasn't too big, but was loud enough for everyone to hear, "I admit defeat." On both sides of the entire battlefield, there was a moment of dead silence. Not a single person opened their mouths to speak, and almost everyone was looking at Salanji on the battlefield with unbelievable eyes. Many even suspected that their ears were hallucinating. Even Luo Song on the battlefield had trouble comprehending how Salanji could possibly admit defeat at such a time. One had to know that if he conceded, then the Paji family would only have one last person left. That person would need to face Luo Song first if he reappeared on the battlefield. Even after winning, he would still have to face the last person of the three allied families. Luo Song, right now, still retained a relatively strong fighting force. Was Salanji that confident in that person who was about to make his debut? Luo Song could not understand. Only Zhang Yi smiled and nodded when he saw Salanji walking towards this side of the army formation without looking back. A smart man. Salanji was Pa Jigsawn's true beloved, inseparable from Pa Jigsawn. He had learned a lot from his ears over the years. Therefore, he was not a reckless person, knowing that there was no point in sending himself to death in vain, and that living was the only way to create a higher value. The most crucial thing was that he was also the only person in the current Paji family who knew Zhang Yi's identity besides Pa Jigsawn. If there is an epsilon-level powerhouse pressing at the back and telling you to feel at ease despite yourselves, then Salanji would only be able to call it foolishness if he thought he was fighting for his life again. It wasn't until Salanji walked back to the military formation and came before Pa Jigsawn with one hand on his chest and bowed, that the Paji family had to accept the facts at hand. Many people were filled with righteous indignation and denounced Salanji's cowardice. But Pa Jigsawn said to him smilingly, "You have done your best, very good. Knowing how to preserve the living forces, you have not followed me in vain all these years." The crowd was surprised at Pa Jigsawn's attitude, and Pa Jigsawn did not explain, letting Salanji go down to receive treatment. Instead, Salanji said, "My body can still hold up, I hope to be able to see this battle through." As he said that, his gaze looked over to Zhang Yi's side. He was also curious if Zhang Yi was going to personally fight as a way to ensure that this battle would be won. Either way, there was bound to be a top-notch fighter crossing paths, and he didn't want to miss it. Chapter 1299 Leang Yu's appearance. Salanji's admission of defeat left Luo Song puzzled. Inexplicably, he won. In reality, if Salanji really fought him to the death, even if he won, he would only be able to win miserably. Both hanging out in the snowy plateau, although these head mutants seldom fought each other directly, they were able to roughly understand each other's strength through various intelligence. Salanji was definitely not an opponent to be underestimated. However, very quickly, Luo Song felt indignant inside again. If Salanji didn't intend to fight with him at all, wouldn't it mean that this half-day's beating was for nothing? Salanji chased after him and hacked him for 3 blocks before turning away in style. But the wind was suffocating. However, Deiji and the others didn't care about that at all. Their faces were filled with smiles, having already won 2 of their opponents. As long as they won the last person, then they had won the final victory. Xiaja Gyatso frowned slightly, although there was a relaxed smile on his face. He still said cautiously, "Even Salanji has conceded defeat, they look a bit strange." I just don't know whether they have already given up on winning or losing, or whether they have a more powerful backhand. Hearing this, La Min Oju also nodded and said cautiously, Chief Monk, the last warrior to go to battle was arranged by you personally, so we originally didn't need to worry. However, the other party is so confident, could there be a mutant of Epsilon level present? Epsilon was a dividing line, and the difference in strength between the upper and lower levels was incomparably huge. As long as the other party was an Epsilon, then at this point, even if they sent out a 9,900-point mutant, they would still need to go through a wheel battle with 2 warriors from the 3 allied armies, and would be at a natural disadvantage. Chief Monk's gaze looked into the distance. That was the direction of the Great Snow Mountain. Don't worry about it, if they really sent out an Epsilon-level mutant, this battle will become easier instead. The meaning was already very clear. If an external force intervened in the snowy region, especially if an Epsilon-level powerhouse made a move, the Undertaker, as the guardian god of the snowy plateau, would definitely not intervene regardless. As long as he was within the range where the Great Snow Mountain's Buddha's light could be seen, the Undertaker was invincible and fearless of any opponent. With Deiji's assurance, the 2 family heads were much more relieved at this point. Soon their gazes looked towards the opposite army formation and began to wait for the other side to send out their 3rd warrior. Deiji was old and his gaze was a bit cloudy, but in the midst of the cloudiness, there was an occasional flash of sternness. He guessed that the native mutants of Paji's family could no longer hold their own. Therefore, the next one on the field must be the mercenary hired by the other party. The man in the video image who was covered in pitch-black armor and had slaughtered 4 of Sangha Temple's protector Vidra. But soon, he knew that he had guessed wrong. Amidst the slightly nervous eyes of Pa Jigsaw and the others, Zhang Yi signaled that Leang Yu could go on. He didn't forget to remind, kill them all, don't hold back. Leang Yu replied, I know, a life and death duel is honorable. Just like the life and death ring between martial artists, I won't be soft. Flower had already burrowed into Liang Yu's arms along the seams of her clothes by now. According to Zhang Yi's instructions, it would not make a move for the time being, but would wait for the critical moment, such as if Liang Yu was in danger before it went on. After all, it was a strange soldier. If it was put in the open, the other party would be on the defensive instead. Thus, Liang Yu wore a silver-gray exoskeleton armor and walked towards the snowfield battlefield with a long sword in hand. With her armor on, no one knew who she really was, but it was still possible to tell that she was a woman through her figure. Regarding Liang Yu, the outside world did not know much about her. Even Pa Jigsaw only knew that she was a mutant beside Zhang Yi. On the other side, Luo Song had already taken medication to suppress the injuries in his body and injected stimulants to temporarily boost his body's explosive power as well as make his body's pain sensation weaker. His huge cloth pocket-like body landed on all 4s, golden flames blazing on the surface of his skin, his eyes staring deathly at the last opponent in front of him. As long as he defeated Liang Yu, he would be able to represent the allied camp and win the final victory. Liang Yu stepped onto the battlefield. The white vapor that filled the sky around him made it impossible to see the scene. Liang Yu slowly drew the long sword in his hand and raised it high. The snowy long sword slashed downward in the air. Boom! A blue stream of air instantly exploded out from the body of the sword. Above the entire battlefield, the white vapor that filled the area was viciously split in half from the center, and then rolled backwards to both sides. Soon, the white mist above the battlefield was expelled, allowing everyone to see its original appearance. Luo Song stared at Liang Yu with a deadly stare, intending to repeat his old trick. His body swiftly rotated, transforming into a huge fireball that rumbled and crushed towards Liang Yu. The raging flames exuded a blazing gaowen, and the fat grease formed an excellent protective layer on the surface of his body, which was the best means of restraining physical attacks. Liang Yu raised his left arm without haste, and the armor on his left arm buzzed with a sound, revealing the launching device underneath. Liang Yu aimed at Luo Song's rolling direction. He was like a huge fireball, rapidly approaching, even from hundreds of meters away, already able to feel its gaowen. Without hesitation, Liang Yu fired out a dozen mini-missiles, blocking the direction Luo Song was coming from. Rumble. The missiles exploded in the area around Luosang, rising a large amount of dense white smoke. Luosang's body stagnated for a moment as he rolled, and even the flames on his body quickly dimmed with a huff as if they were blown by a gale. What Leang Yu had launched was not an ordinary missile, but a special missile with liquid nitrogen inside. As one of the best refrigeration elements in the world, it could quickly reduce the surrounding temperature to -200 degrees. Luosang's ability was flame, and liquid nitrogen could absorb the heat he released and consume his supernatural ability. As expected, this extreme low temperature was too much lower than the temperature in the air, and the heat released by Luosang's flame was absorbed in large quantities. This also led to the power of the flames he was able to release being greatly weakened when he arrived in front of Leang Yu's body. Facing the flesh bullet chariot that came in front of him, Leang Yu did not blindly use his long sword to slash. The rolling stance of Luosang, coupled with the grease on the surface of the skin, could greatly dislodge the physical attacks coming from all angles. A rash strike would even be counterattacked by his torso. Leang Yu, as an expert of the practical combat school, had observed his fight with Salanji from outside the arena, and of course would not make the same mistake. She leapt up in the air and dodged the rolling Luosang. Taking off in the air, Leang Yu was like a nimble bird of prey, while her slender and elongated fingers were illuminated by the firelight, with strands of golden light flickering faintly. Chapter 1300 Nanowire. Luosang rushed through the area where Leang Yu was, and was deftly dodged by Leang Yu. However, in Leang Yu's left hand, an extremely thin nano thread was fired out from the launcher. Luosang's momentum did not diminish, and after failing to score, he once again rushed towards Leang Yu. Leang Yu repeated her trick and continued to fire liquid nitrogen to consume Luosang. She didn't even need to intentionally shoot Luosang. After all, this kind of liquid nitrogen missile didn't have much offensive properties, it was only able to reduce the temperature of the surrounding environment significantly. On the other hand, Luosang, who continued to release flames, would constantly release energy to the outside world. The presence of liquid nitrogen caused the consumption of his supernatural energy to increase drastically, and the power of the flames also weakened drastically. Luosang's heart sank as he sensed his opponent's tactics. He had to take advantage of his body's strong defense and adopt a chariot attack to continue charging Leang Yu. Leang Yu did not receive the attack, dodging Luosang again and again. She was extremely fast, dodging Luosang like she was playing dodgeball, calm and graceful, without any semblance of haste. After a dozen rounds of dodging, Luosang finally stopped his movements. It wasn't that he was tired, but he suddenly realized that his movements had been interfered with by something, so much so that his skin ached as if it had been cut by countless scalpels. Along with that, his movements became sluggish. Luosang stopped and carefully went to look at his body, and suddenly his pupil shrunk violently. He didn't know when, but his body was actually wrapped with an extremely thin silk thread. Those were silk threads made of nanomaterials with extremely high toughness. When it first started wrapping around his body, Leang Yu did not send out any force to pull it, but kept releasing it. With the help of Luosang's rolling, it quickly wrapped around his entire body. This extremely fine silk thread, even if it was wrapped around his body, it wouldn't feel much. But after increasing in number loop after loop, it produced a different effect. Inside his plump grease, the nanofilament threads sunk deep into it. With the power of his own rolling, the nanofilament threads began to cut into his fat. This principle was just like him strangling his fat into a large net. Only the material used to make the net was nanosilk threads that were sharper than swords and incredibly tough. If one is still unaware and continues to fight. At that time, Leang Yu would not need to do anything, he would kill himself. Luosang's scalp was numb, and his body felt incomparably cold. This kind of fighting style was unheard of and only seen in his life. However, it wasn't his fault. When the Southwest region decided to return to the past era of Tusi rule, their infighting as well as retrofitting had caused them to create a noticeable backwardness in all sorts of areas, including combat thinking and techniques. While they were still stuck in fighting with the help of brute force, practical combatants like Liang Yu and Zhang Yi had long since begun fighting with nothing to lose. Liang Yu looked at Luo Song, who had stopped moving, and said indifferently, "It looks like you've finally realized it." Carrying her long sword, she took a step towards Luo Song. "I advise you better not act rashly, otherwise, you'll easily be cut into pieces of minced meat." Luo Song sniffed, and immediately laughed coldly in anger. "You think that this kind of little trick will be able to bind me? How ridiculous!" Although he didn't know what kind of silk thread Liang Yu had used, how could this extremely thin weapon cause much damage to his flesh body with its amazing defense? "Ow!" Luo Song roared in rage, and his body swelled up violently. He was like a yellow pocket of cloth, and as he swelled, the threads of silk that were wrapped around his torso became clear. To be exact, it was the indentations on his body that had been deeply strangled and that looked somewhat hideous. Luo Song lashed out. Poof! Poof! Pft! Poof! A silk thread made of nanomaterials was actually hardened and collapsed. However, his flesh and blood were also cut open with it in a hideous gash. "Ah!" Luo Song wailed out once again, but this time, he wailed because of the pain. Zhang Yi couldn't help but suck in a breath of cool air. What a ruthless man! But also an idiot. Luo Song didn't even know what nanomaterials meant. This kind of silk thread was unimaginably tough. It wasn't like it was some kind of steel wire. To attempt to break it with flesh and blood, one could only say that courage was commendable, but intelligence was a concern. Soon Luo Song was drenched in blood, fat oil and blood flowed everywhere, his body was full of wounds. The more pain he felt to pull, those nanosilk threads wrapped all over his body instead wound tighter and tighter, just like a ball of threads that could not be torn apart. And at this moment, Liang Yu had already killed in front of him with a sword. Luo Song's pupil shrunk violently, his throat squirmed violently. As Liang Yu approached his body, he suddenly opened his mouth wide, and a Vajra mortar and pestle unexpectedly shot out from his throat, heading straight for Liang Yu's face. Liang Yu didn't dodge, the long sword in his hand was wrapped in blue qi, and he slashed directly over. Clang! The Vajra pestle was directly bounced off. Liang Yu came to Luo Song's nearness and raised his sword to slash. Luo Song was truly in a hurry at this moment, his body released super Gaowen flames, a fire dragon spewed out from his mouth, circling and wrapping Liang Yu completely. But soon, Liang Yu's silver-white figure rushed out of the flames. The exoskeleton armor on her body was handcrafted by Lu Karen, and was able to withstand both super high and super low temperatures. Even if it was a Gaowen of thousands of degrees, it wouldn't be a problem to withstand it for a short period of time. And at this moment, Liang Yu had already killed Luo Song's near front. He was cocooned. Originally the nanosilk threads released by Liang Yu were simply loosely wrapped around him. However, as he continued to roll as well as struggle, causing these irregularly entangled nanofilaments to become tighter and tighter. As long as he exerted the slightest bit of force and tried to move, the threads that were deeply sunk into his flesh and blood would continue to cut, causing his body and mind to ache as if he was being lynched. Die! Liang Yu's cold voice came out like the god of death. Her silhouette had already arrived in front of Luo Song. The long sword in her hand was aimed at his fat-filled stomach, and a blade wrapped in blue qi sliced across. The speed of this sword was too fast, and when Luo Song, whose movement was restricted, wanted to dodge, the sword had already swept through a blue residual shadow in the air. Luo Song only felt a coldness above his stomach. Immediately afterward, there was a pain so intense that it was unimaginable. Pooh! His body was directly split in two by Liang Yu from his abdomen, and a large amount of contents instantly flowed out, yellow fat oil, intestines and internal organs full of grease, clattering pour out all over the place. Liang Yu quickly retreated a dozen meters after the sword, and managed to avoid these things. However, seeing this scene, the people on both sides of the battlefield still couldn't help but regurgitate, and even couldn't help but want to vomit.